Yesterday you saw the release of those two big reports into the violence that killed over 350 people in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal in July 2021. The reports found there was no evidence of a link between the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma and the violence, but they also found there is still tension in the area around Phoenix. Remember at the time how Indian people were accused of killing black people. There have been several court proceedings, at least one, in which 2 Indian people have been convicted of at least attempted murder of a black person at that time. Indian people claim to be protecting their communities. Crispin Hemson is the director of the International Center for Nonviolence. He studied this area for many years. Crispin, good afternoon to you. This report really examines the tensions around Phoenix, and there's particular reference to history, to the violence in Inanda in 1985, and even further back to violence in Durban in 1949. Do you think these reports have managed to really get to the real issues?
I think so. By the way, I'm the former director now. Things have moved on. But I think in a way that if you read the report, you just read the accounts of what happened at the time, you get a sense that there are things behind this which go beyond the issues around instigators and so on, who was instigating. It's a very separate issue about what was the environment in which they were instigating this violence. And why did they know they'd be able to create such chaos so easily? And that answer, I think, lies in that history. So, I mean, I just found reading the evidence from witnesses of the actual events was actually very shocking, but also very illuminating. And I was struck by how some of those people, there were people who were just victims, and then you had people like Roshan Jainath in Pietermaritzburg, whose testimony is so clearly analytical as well as honest in reporting what happened.
It's interesting to see you talk about people who were instigating violence, inciting violence, who knew that they could create violence, that if they acted in particular ways, there would be violence between these communities, or members of these communities, rather. Is it sort of obvious that there's tension there? Clearly, the people instigating the violence could see that and they clearly knew what to do. I mean, that's the terrible thing, isn't it?
Yeah, so one of the things struck me was that how many of people insisted that everything was fine, that until there was an instigation, there was nothing wrong. But hold on, if there had been nothing wrong before the instigation, there wouldn't have been this mayhem to the same extent. So, I mean, the interesting thing is also how you had this issue of barricades that were set up, and frankly, in many cases, I think a very rational response to what was going wrong. Barricades were set up, but the way those barricades were handled was very different from area to area. And I think that's very significant because it shows that we are dealing with, there's a history to it, but there's a huge element of agency. How do people act as leaders in response to this provocation? And that's a very interesting part of it. But I'm afraid so many of leaders or people in leadership positions actually really reacted in the worst possible way. I mean, I think the accounts, for example, of the Phoenix police station are very shocking. I mean, a complete and absolute failure of responsibility and a failure of professionalism. And that was really terrible.
We have these communities living side by side, but still so separated. And I mean, in a way, that's often the case of our cities in South Africa. Is there sort of social mixing at all, or does it only take place economically, in which case one group is richer than the other group, and one group essentially employs the other group and tells them what to do?
Look, I think there are many areas of mixing of a kind. But to give you some indication, I was working on a first-year module, and I would be asked to work on a lecture to do with race and racism. So I actually just contacted different young people I knew, young people, not older people, because that's the age of the students. And I said, well, what is your experience of racism? And there are some remarkable things that I learned from it. first, we really do have a serious problem. It may well be less of a problem for some young people nowadays because there have been quite specific shifts. But listening to a working class person from a mixed background, I mean, his account of racial divisions in the workplace was truly shocking, and would explain a lot of what you saw emerge in certain contexts, only certain contexts in this province. And I think it's truly unhelpful to keep protesting that we were all getting on fine before this happened. I don't think that's honest. Or if it was honest, then people haven't asked the right questions or noticed enough. Yeah, there is a problem with racism. Of course people get by. All kinds of pressures to get by. But when we have to deal with a serious social issue, like the context of that time, it's so difficult to get a unified response because of these deep divisions and the repetition of the stereotypes. And here, actually, the report, I think, is quite correct, that there's a particular stereotype about, sort of working class black men and so on, which is like very dangerous. And we cannot afford that.
So we know from what you say, from what the report says, that certain people living in that area knew how to instigate violence. They knew they'll be successful. There must be people, including yourself, who know that there are ways to build divisions, to increase diversity, to increase the chances of people who grow up from different communities actually living together, working together, maybe living together next door to each other, etc. How do we do that? And I don't know if there's been really any change at all to the situation in Phoenix since 2021.
Yeah, I don't think there has been change. I think people retreated back to where they've been before. And there is this underlying anger and resentment, which is actually there. And it's really quite scary if you suddenly touch on it in a particular context. So, I mean, I think the way to do it is not to do it very directly in the sense we are now going to be talking as, I don't know, white and African young people together. I think actually it is around focusing on how do we work effectively in tackling significant issues. For example, we need to tackle climate change. We need to tackle the environmental, the growing environmental problems that we encounter here. Issues like water and sewage. These are now issues that we have to mobilize about. We didn't think of mobilizing around them for some years. We have to mobilize around them. Those joint campaigns are the opportunity, I believe, where we can start understanding each other at a deeper level and then perhaps start identifying what the confusions were that kept us apart. The other thing that struck me, I was by the Pigeon Valley Nature Reserve and watching people pushing trolleys up on the 13th of July, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And I was thinking, there's this, people have mobilized themselves. Why do we fail as a society to mobilize these people's intelligence, their capabilities to create a better society, instead of just seeing us in total opposition with them and of playing into stereotypes? So it's something about a choice in our minds to say we will treat people always as our potential allies and not as people we have to defend ourselves against.